My name is Rowan Blanchat, and I am 31 years old. 6 years ago, my sister told my mother, my father, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, and every person who had ever watched me grow up in that small Ohio town that I had stolen money from our family. Not borrowed, not mishandled, stolen. She said I had drained our parents' savings account, the one they'd quietly built over 30 years of early mornings and double shifts, and used it to fund what she called some selfish fantasy life in Boston while they struggled to keep the lights on back home. She lied. Every word of it was a lie. Not an exaggeration, not a misremembering, not a story filtered through someone else's hurt feelings. A deliberate, constructed, specific lie with details she had invented from scratch, and delivered with the kind of calm certainty that makes everyone around you stop questioning. Within 2 weeks of that lie being told, my father changed the locks on the house I still had belongings in. My mother stopped answering my calls. My Aunt Patricia, who had held my hand at my grandmother's funeral and called me her second daughter for 27 years, sent me a text message that said, "Don't contact this family again until you're ready to apologize and make things right." My cousin Becca, who I had driven 4 hours to help move into her first apartment 8 months earlier, blocked me on every platform without a word. I was in Boston. I was 25 years old. I was in the middle of my first year of graduate school, a full scholarship, not a single dollar of my parents' money, and I had $43 in my checking account because I had just paid rent, and I sat on the floor of my studio apartment with my phone in my hand watching the read receipts disappear one by one as people blocked me before I could even finish typing my responses, and I thought, this is what it feels like to stop existing to the people who made you. Then last month, my sister was in a car accident. She was airlifted to Massachusetts General Hospital. I work at Massachusetts General Hospital. Before I tell you what happened in that hallway, what I said, what she said, what my mother's face looked like when she realized where she was and who was standing in front of her, I need to take you back. Because none of what happened in that hospital makes sense without understanding what came before it, and what came before it goes back much further than the lie. It goes back to the beginning. It goes back to the girl I was before I understood that some people in your family will see your light and decide, quietly, privately, with great deliberation, that they would prefer you did not shine quite so brightly. I grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, which is the kind of town that appears in sentences like just outside of, and about 40 minutes from, but never in the sentence itself. It was not a bad town. I want to be clear about that because I've spent years being careful not to romanticize my childhood pain or villainize a place that was, in many ways, full of decent and hard-working people. My parents were among them. My father, Gerald Blanchat, worked plant maintenance at a packaging facility for 23 years. My mother, Diane Blanchat née Cook, managed the front office of a pediatric dental practice for most of my childhood, and then, when I was about 12, shifted to part-time when my grandmother's health declined and she needed to help with care. They were steady people, routine people, people who believed in keeping your word, showing up on time, not making a fuss and staying in your lane. I learned early that staying in your lane in our house meant something specific. It meant not wanting more than what the family had decided was appropriate to want. My sister's name is Cassandra. Cassie, everyone called her. She is 3 years older than me, which put her in that particular position of power that older siblings in small families hold, the one who arrived first, who established the template, who taught the parents what a child was supposed to look like before you came along and confused things. Cassie was beautiful in the way that is immediately legible to everyone in a room. Dark hair, our mother's dark eyes, a laugh that started in her whole chest. She was the kind of girl who made friends effortlessly and kept them loyally, at least in the eyes of the adults watching. She was the kind of girl who walked into a room and made the air shift. Teachers loved her. Extended family adored her. She sang in the church choir and played volleyball and dated the kind of boys that fathers shake hands with at the front door. I was not that girl. I was quiet. I was interested in things that didn't translate well to dinner table conversation, protein folding, the mechanics of cellular repair, the question of why some bodies heal and some don't. I read constantly and was privately embarrassed about how much I read because in my house reading was something you did when you were done with the actual things that mattered. I had friends, but not the kind you parade. My best friend growing up was a girl named Ren Okaffer, whose father was a professor at the small community college 20 minutes away, and who was, like me, the kind of person who existed slightly to the left of where everyone else was standing. Ren and I spent our weekends doing things that didn't photograph well, dissecting owl pellets she ordered online, watching documentaries about the immune system, making elaborate plans for futures that felt, in Millbrook, Ohio, almost embarrassingly ambitious. My parents loved me. I believe that. I want to put that on the record clearly and early because the story I'm about to tell you could easily read as a story about bad parents, and that's not quite right. They loved me the way you love something you don't entirely understand, with genuine feeling, but without real comprehension, which is a particular kind of love that leaves you warm enough to survive but hungry for something you can't name. They came to my school events. They asked about my grades. My mother braided my hair until I was old enough to refuse it, and my father taught me to change a tire in the parking lot of the church on a Saturday afternoon in October when I was 15, and I remember thinking that afternoon, this is what it feels like to be seen by him. A parking lot, a lug wrench, a cold Saturday, that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and I knew it was enough, and I didn't let myself want more. But there was always Cassie. Cassie, who existed in my parents' attention the way the sun exists in a solar system, not malevolently, not with intention, just as the organizing center around which everything else orbited. When Cassie got a speaking role in the school play, my mother cried in the third row and told everyone at Sunday dinner about it for 3 weeks. When I won the regional science competition, first place, a check for $200, a certificate that I framed and hung in my room, my father said, "That's great, Ro," and asked Cassie what she wanted for dinner. I don't say this to assign blame. I say this because you need to understand the physics of our household. You need to understand what it felt like to be the second planet, the one scientists discover after the main discovery and log in the file for completeness. The science competition was when I was 16. I had built a working model of a bacteria-killing surface coating, something I'd read about in a journal article I'd found at the college library, 3 towns over, where the librarian let me have a card even though I wasn't a student there, because she said she'd never seen a high schooler who actually read the medical journals before. I'd spent 4 months on that project. I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning more nights than I can remember. Ren had helped me calibrate the measurements and talked me off the ledge when my first coating cracked under testing. I won, regionally, beating students from schools 10 times the size of mine with actual science departments and funding. My parents came to the competition. They both came, which I want to acknowledge because they drove 40 minutes on a Tuesday evening after work and they sat in the folding chairs and they watched. And when they announced my name, my mother put her hand over her mouth and my father clapped. That happened. That was real. But on the way home, my mother said, "Cassie called today. She heard back from the volleyball clinic. They want her for the summer intensive." And just like that, the competition was over. I sat in the back seat with my certificate in my lap and watched the dark fields go by, and I told myself that this was fine, that I didn't need more than this, that wanting more than this was greedy. I was 16. I was very practiced at reducing the size of my own needs. Cassie graduated 2 years before me and went to Columbus for school, not Ohio State, but a smaller university there, studying communications. She came home for holidays and called our mother 3 times a week, and when she was home the house filled up in a way it didn't when it was just me in it. I don't mean that unkindly. I mean it as pure observed fact. Cassie occupied space differently than I did. She filled rooms, I inhabited corners. When I was a junior in high school, I decided, with the kind of quiet, private certainty that comes from spending a lot of time alone with your own thoughts, that I wanted to be a physician, not just a doctor. I had a specific image: research-adjacent medicine, the intersection of laboratory and clinical practice, the place where you take what is understood in theory and apply it to an actual human body. I didn't tell my parents this right away because I'd learned, by 17, to test the temperature of the water before I stepped in. I told Ren first. I told her on a Friday night in her bedroom, and she looked at me with those steady dark eyes of hers and said, "Obviously," as if this were information she had been waiting for me to arrive at, as if it was so clear from where she was standing that my delay in reaching it was almost comical. I started building my application junior year. I got a job at the local urgent care center as a front desk administrator, not glamorous, not clinical, but I learned to read medical charts, I learned to watch the physicians move through the space, I learned what a patient looks like when they're frightened versus when they're in actual distress. I asked questions. I annotated the medical journals I'd been reading for years with new context. I wrote my personal statement 17 times. I asked my AP biology teacher, Mr. Croft, to review my application materials, and he did 3 times, staying after school each time, telling me on the last reading that he thought I had a real shot at somewhere serious. The night I got my acceptance to Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine, which was not where I applied for undergrad, to be clear, this was the beginning of a long road, and I'm compressing for sanity. I was 22 years old and sitting in my Boston apartment, where I had moved after undergrad to work as a research coordinator at a hospital lab. Case Western's acceptance to their MD program was not my first acceptance. I had been building toward this for 6 years at that point, but it was the one that broke open something in my chest. I called my mother. She answered, which was notable because she didn't always answer when I called, a pattern I'd long since stopped trying to analyze. I told her I'd gotten in, full consideration for merit funding. I'd found out at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That's wonderful, Rowan." A pause. "Have you told Cassie yet?" I hadn't. I told her after. Cassie at that point was back in Millbrook. The communications degree hadn't gone anywhere particularly specific, and she was working at a PR firm in Columbus but had moved back home 6 months earlier following the end of a long relationship, which I understood, which I didn't judge. She'd been home almost 8 months when I got the acceptance. She'd been living in our parents' house. She'd been at every Sunday dinner. She'd been present in our parents' daily lives in a way that I, building something in Boston 700 miles away, simply was not. When I called Cassie to tell her about the acceptance, I was still shaking with the particular adrenaline of enormous news. I told her everything: Case Western, the program, the funding, what it meant for the path I'd been on. I was, I think, looking for a version of the conversation I'd always wanted to have with someone in my family. Someone who would say, "I always knew this was where you were going." Someone who would make the moment feel as big as it was. Cassie said congratulations. She said she was proud of me. She asked what Boston was like, and I told her about my apartment and my colleagues and the work I was doing in the lab, and she listened, and at the end she said, "Mom and Dad must be so happy." "I think so," I said. "Mom seemed happy." "They've been worried about you," Cassie said, and something in her voice was careful in a way I didn't register as significant at the time. "You being so far away, not coming home as much." "I know," I said. "I know, it'll be better when I'm more settled." "Yeah," she said, "definitely." That was the conversation. I thought nothing of it. I hung up and celebrated with a glass of wine that cost $7 and sat on my apartment floor and let myself feel, for the first time in a very long time, like I had done something that could not be taken from me. I was 22 years old, and I did not yet understand that there are people in your life who watch you build something real and decide, somewhere in the unexamined darkness of themselves, that this cannot stand. I want to talk about Ren for a moment, because Ren is important and she doesn't get enough of the story. Ren Okafor and I had been best friends since 6th grade, which is the kind of friendship that forms in the specific conditions of being two slightly strange girls in a town that didn't quite have a category for them. We had followed each other at a distance across our divergent early paths. She had gone to Northwestern for English literature, and then come back to Ohio for a master's in library science, which was the most Ren thing imaginable, and we talked on the phone every Sunday morning without fail, a habit we'd established when I left for college that had simply never stopped. Ren was the person I debriefed with after every family interaction. She was the person who remembered every piece of context, who could locate a current conversation within the full history of everything that had come before it. It was Ren who, after my Case Western acceptance call, said, "You know Cassie's going to have a reaction to this." "She seemed fine," I said. "She was happy." "She seemed fine," Ren repeated, making those 3 words do more work than I was ready for. "Ro, you just eclipsed her. She's been home for 8 months, things aren't going great for her, and you just called to tell her you're going to medical school." "I know," I said, "but it's not a competition." Ren was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was deciding how honest to be. Then she said, "It might not be for you." I told her she was being dramatic. I believed that. I want to be honest about that. I was not naive about Cassie's competitive streak, but I had spent 22 years wanting to believe the best version of our relationship, and I was not ready in that moment to let go of it. I told Ren that Cassie had been genuinely supportive, and Ren said, "Okay," in a tone that meant *, I will circle back to this. She did circle back. 18 months later, after everything had collapsed, she said, "I want you to know I'm not saying I told you so. I'm saying I see you." That was the whole sentence, I see you. In the rubble of my entire family structure, it was the most important thing anyone had ever said to me. I started at Case Western in the fall. I moved to Cleveland. I was 22 years old. I was working on a research stipend. I had secured a federal loan for living expenses, and not $1 of my parents' savings was involved. I want to make this very clear because the entire lie that would eventually be told about me depended on obscuring this fact. I was financing my own life. I had been financing my own life since I left for college at 18. My parents had contributed to my undergraduate education, a contribution I was grateful for and that I had never taken for granted, but by the time I started medical school, I was entirely self-funded. Loans, stipends, grants, a part-time job my first semester doing data entry for a research lab that paid $11 an hour, before I was absorbing enough of the curriculum to make working an untenable luxury. I called home every 2 weeks, sometimes less during exam periods. I sent cards at Christmas and on my parents' birthdays. I texted my mother photos of my apartment, my study space, small mundane things, a soup I'd made, a view from the library window, a funny thing I'd seen at the coffee shop near campus. I was trying to maintain a connection across 350 miles, and the particular distance created by having a life that didn't look like anything anyone in my family had done before. I was trying to remain legible to them. Cassie was still home, still at Sunday dinners, still calling 3 times a week. I knew this not because my parents told me much about her life, but because I could feel it in the texture of our conversations. The way my mother would reference Cassie's opinion on something, the way my father would mention what they'd done that weekend, always framed around what Cassie had organized or suggested. I was building my life, she was living inside theirs. Somewhere in the middle of my first year, something shifted. I started noticing it in the calls home, a slight adjustment in my mother's tone, not coldness exactly, more like a careful neutral, a managed distance. When I mentioned my courses, she was attentive but oddly brief. When I mentioned my research work, I had been folded into a cellular regeneration study that was genuinely exciting, the kind of work that made me incapable of sleeping from sheer intellectual excitement. She listened and said things like, "That sounds complicated, and I'm sure you know what you're doing." It felt slowly, like speaking to someone who had gotten partial information about me that they were trying to reconcile with the person they were talking to. I noticed. I didn't ask. That was a failure of mine, one I've examined from every angle, but I was 23 years old and in my first year of medical school and barely surviving the workload, and the idea that something was actively wrong at home felt like a weight I couldn't afford to pick up while I was already carrying everything else. Then, in March of my first year, my father called me. My father almost never called me. My mother was the communication point. When my father called, it meant something specific. I remember I was in the library. I remember the call came at 7:23 in the evening because I looked at my phone and thought bizarrely, why is he calling on a Tuesday, as if there were days that would have made it less alarming? I stepped out into the stairwell and answered. He said, "Rowan, I need to ask you something." The way he said it, not *hey Ro, how are you, listen, but just that directly with the weight already in his voice, I knew. I didn't know the specifics yet, but I knew the tone. It was the tone of someone who has already reached a conclusion and is asking a question not because they want to learn the answer, but because they want to see if you'll lie to them. "Okay," I said. "Did you take money from our savings account?" And there it was. The first feeling was physical, a dropping sensation in my stomach, a sudden cold, then, immediately after, confusion. Genuine, pure confusion, because the question was so disconnected from any reality I inhabited that my brain was trying to parse it the way it parses a sentence in a language it doesn't speak, searching for patterns, finding none. "What?" I said. "No, Dad, what are you talking about?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your sister said she has proof." 3 seconds of silence. 5, 10. I was counting the tiles on the stairwell wall without meaning to. White, grey-veined white, a scuff mark at eye level. "That's not possible," I said. "I haven't touched your savings account. I don't have access to your savings account." "Cassie showed us transfers," he said. "Account numbers." "Dad, don't do what you're about to do." His voice was quiet in a way that was worse than loud. Cassie sat at this table and showed us documentation. She showed us numbers. She's very upset. Your mother is very upset. I was standing in a library stairwell at 7:23 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, and my father was telling me my sister had documentation of something that had not happened. My brain was still trying to find the translation. I still thought that this was a misunderstanding, a mistake, numbers that looked similar, an account number that resembled mine, some clerical error that had gotten tangled in Cassie's interpretation. "Can you send me what she showed you?" I said. "Whatever documentation she has, send it to me. Let me look at it. This doesn't make sense. I don't have access to that account. I never have." My father said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Cassie said you'd say that." And I understood in that moment that I had already been tried. The documentation she had shown them, I found out later, through an extremely painful series of conversations with my cousin Becca, who was the only person who talked to me for more than 30 seconds over the following 2 weeks, was fabricated. Cassie had made it herself. She had taken screenshots of some transfer records she'd photographed from our parents' computer during one of her many Sunday visits, photoshopped names and numbers, and printed them out on regular printer paper. The account numbers she'd used were real. She'd lifted them from actual bank documents in the house, but the transactions themselves were invented. My name inserted where no name had been, amounts pulled from thin air. My father told me that Tuesday in the stairwell that he and my mother needed time, that they needed me to not call for a while, that they would reach out when they were ready. He did not say goodbye before he hung up. I would like to tell you that I handled the next 2 weeks with some semblance of grace. I did not. I handled them the way a person handles the structural collapse of something they had built their entire interior life around, which is to say, not well, not gracefully, not with anything resembling composure. I went back to my library carrel and sat there for 45 minutes staring at my biochemistry notes, which had stopped meaning anything, and then I called Wren. Wren picked up on the second ring. I told her what had happened. She was silent for the entire telling, and then she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." She was 3 states away, finishing her master's, and she organized the next steps with the methodical calm of someone who had been anticipating exactly this scenario. She told me to email my parents with documentation of my own finances, bank statements, the loan records, the stipend letters, anything that showed where my money came from, and confirmed I had no access to their accounts. She told me to CC her as a witness. She told me to write it clearly and without anger, just facts. I did all of that. I sent the email that same night at 11:15 p.m. with 8 attachments, bank statements from the past 3 years, my medical school financial aid package, my loan servicer's contact information, a letter from my bank confirming my account history and the accounts attached to my name, a copy of the research stipend agreement. A note at the end that said, "I don't know what documentation Cassie showed you, but I can promise you that any suggestion I accessed your accounts is false. I am happy to speak to anyone, your bank, my bank, a mediator, to resolve this. I love you, please call me." My mother read it. I can see the read receipt, 11:52 p.m. She read it for 37 minutes, or she left it open for 37 minutes, which I chose to interpret as reading, and then she did not respond. My father's email bounced back the next morning. He had already blocked me. I called 14 times over the next 5 days. The first 3 went to voicemail, my mother's voicemail, which I had memorized from calling it since I was a child, her voice calm and familiar saying, "You've reached Diane, please leave a message," and I left messages. Careful messages, not pleading, not frantic. Just, "Mom, it's Rowan, I sent documentation, please call me, I need us to talk about this." The 4th call, blocked. The 5th through 14th, blocked. I called Cassie, once. The phone rang 4 times and went to her own voicemail. I did not leave a message because I could not trust what would come out of my mouth. I hung up and sat with the phone in my hand, and I thought, she knew this would happen. She planned for this to happen. Every detail was designed for exactly this outcome. I sent my parents a letter through the mail, an actual handwritten letter, 4 pages with the documentation printed out and folded inside. I sent it certified mail. The tracking number showed it delivered. It was never signed for. It was returned to me unopened 6 weeks later. Aunt Patricia, who I have mentioned, was my last attempt at an intermediary, my mother's older sister, a woman I had called Aunt Patty for 27 years, who had a framed photo of me on her mantel from my undergrad graduation, who had cried at that graduation, who had pulled me into a hug in the parking lot afterward and whispered, "Your grandmother would have been so proud." I called Aunt Patricia on a Wednesday afternoon, my voice doing the thing voices do when you've been trying not to cry for 2 weeks, that careful flatness that's louder than crying. I told her what was happening. I told her I had documentation. I told her I needed her to be a bridge. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Rowan, honey, Cassie has always looked out for this family." "I know she has," I said, "but Aunt Patty, she's lying. Whatever she showed them isn't real. I can send you everything I sent Mom and Dad." Another pause. "Sometimes," she said, "when we've been away for a long time, we lose sight of how our choices affect the people back home." I heard what she was saying. I heard the shape of the story she'd already been given. Not theft, distance. Not fraud, abandonment. The lie had been wrapped in something older and more ambient. The narrative that I had left, that I had been selfish in leaving, that my going away to build something was itself a kind of taking. "I didn't take anything from them," I said. "I think," Aunt Patricia said carefully, "you should give everyone some time to cool down, then come home and talk to them in person." I said I would try. I did not come home, not because I didn't want to. I would have driven or flown home that weekend, at the cost of groceries I couldn't afford if I'd thought it would help, but because give everyone some time translated in practice to my number being blocked across the entire family within the next week. When I called Aunt Patricia 2 days later, her number rang twice and went to a new voicemail message. Different, generic. The kind you set when you're expecting specific calls you don't want to receive. By the end of that month, I had been, for all practical purposes, excised. I want to tell you what it feels like because I think this is the part that people who haven't lived it sometimes can't quite visualize. They hear family estrangement and they picture something dramatic, a final confrontation, a door slamming, a scene. That's not what it was. What it was gradual. It was a series of small doors closing, each one quiet, the absence of a response where a response used to be, the silence where sound used to live. You reach for something that was always there and your hand closes on air, and the horror of it is not the single moment of not finding it. It's the cumulative realization, across days and then weeks, that the thing is genuinely gone. I had nightmares that March and April that were not dramatic. That's what I remember. No monsters, no disasters. I dreamed I was calling my mother and the call just rang. Over and over, rang and rang and rang, and I stood somewhere holding a phone, ringing. I woke up more tired than I'd gone to sleep. I kept going to school. I want you to understand this because I think it's easy in telling a story like this to create a version where the protagonist collapses and then rises. That's not what happened. I did not collapse. I did not have the luxury of collapsing. I was in medical school. I had 23 classmates who depended on study group coherence. I had professors who called on you randomly and did not accept "I'm going through something" as a preparation substitute. I had a research supervisor, Dr. Esme Acharya, who was brilliant and exacting and expected the work to be done, because the work was the work and the world was full of reasons not to do it, and you had to do it anyway. So I did it. I got up at 5:30 every morning and I went to the library and I studied, and I went to class, and I came home and I studied, and I ate food I barely tasted, and I called Ren on Sundays, and I did not cry in class or in the hallways or in front of anyone because I had made an executive decision, somewhere around day 12 of the silence, that I would allow myself 30 minutes per day to feel this, and the rest of the time I would be a person who was going to become a doctor. 30 minutes a day. Sometimes I took them in the shower so the water covered the sound. Sometimes I took them sitting on the floor of my apartment at midnight, just sitting with it, just letting the weight of it be its full weight without trying to manage it. And then the 30 minutes ended and I stood up and I went back to the work. It was not healthy. I know that now. Dr. Pauline Chen, who became my therapist when I was 26, had some very specific things to say about the 30-minute protocol and what it was covering over. But at 23, in the middle of my first year of medical school, it kept me functional. And functional was all I needed. Dr. Esme Acharya deserves her own paragraph, or several. She was 52 years old when I came to Case Western. Indian American, born in Chicago, raised between there and Bangalore, and educated at places that made you want to sit up straighter when you listed them. She ran a research lab focused on wound healing and cellular regeneration, the relationship between the body's inflammatory response and its repair mechanisms, the ways in which we could potentially augment or redirect the healing process. She had been doing this work for 20 years and showed no signs of being less interested in it than she had been at the beginning, which was in itself a kind of instruction. I came to her attention because of the research paper I had submitted with my medical school application, a 30-page analysis of bacterial surface interactions I had written as a research coordinator, the culmination of 3 years of reading and observation, and the $43 library card journals from a college I hadn't attended. She had read it before I arrived. In my first week, she flagged me to request that I consider joining her lab. I joined her lab. What happened next was the specific kind of education that doesn't happen in classrooms. Dr. Acharya ran her lab the way she believed good science should run, with rigor and humility and the constant willingness to be wrong in the service of eventually being right. She gave me assignments that were at the edge of my ability. She corrected my work without cruelty, but without softening either. One time she returned a report I'd written with a single post-it note attached that said "Start over." You know more than this, I started over. The second draft was better. She kept the post-it on her bulletin board, which I later understood to be a form of affection. She also, slowly, without announcement or ceremony, became the person I was able to tell things to. It happened over the course of months. Not deliberately, I was not seeking a replacement parent, and I don't think that's what she was offering. But she was perceptive in the way that scientists who study living systems tend to be perceptive about living systems outside the lab, and she noticed that something had changed in me around March of my first year. She didn't ask directly. She mentioned, offhandedly, one afternoon in the lab when we were the last two there, that she had a particular policy about her students. They were allowed to be human beings in her presence, and that included whatever human beings were dealing with outside the building. I told her 6 weeks later, during a late lab session that had gone quiet in a useful way, that my family had cut off contact with me following a false accusation that I had stolen from them. She listened to the whole thing. When I was finished, she was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said, "You have the documentation proving it was false?" "Yes." "And they won't look at it?" "No." She nodded slowly. "There is a particular kind of damage," she said, "that happens when people choose narrative over evidence. We see it in medicine constantly. Patients who have been told a story about what's wrong with them and who then resist examination because examination might disturb the story." She paused. "It doesn't make the evidence any less real." "I know," I said. "Do you?" she said, not unkindly, as a genuine question. I thought about it. "Not completely," I said. "That's honest." She went back to the slides she'd been preparing. "The work doesn't change," she said. "Whatever is happening at home, the work doesn't change. That's not dismissal, that's something to hold on to." I held on to it. Dr. Acharya became, over the next several years, my professional mentor, my personal anchor, and something that functioned like family without trying to replace what family meant. She was not a replacement parent. She was something new, a person who had watched me work and decided I was worth the investment of her attention, which was, given her attention, a significant gift. She wrote my residency letters. She attended my medical school graduation, sitting in the third row with Ren, when my parents did not attend. She took us both to dinner afterward at the nicest restaurant in Cleveland and ordered champagne, and gave a toast that I have thought about many times since. She said to Rowan, who had every reason to stop and didn't, "That's not luck, that's character." I cried then. I had cried very few times in the previous 3 years. Very carefully, in 30-minute increments. I cried at that dinner table in front of 2 people who had chosen to be there, and it felt clean in a way that contained all the tears I hadn't let myself have. My residency was at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, which meant I came back. Not to Ohio, I was a different person by then, or the same person with the scaffolding more visible, and Boston was the city that had held me through my early 20s, and it was where the program I wanted was. But I came back to the general vicinity of my history, back to the same time zone. Back to a city I had left when I'd gone to Cleveland, only to return with an MD and a research background, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from becoming something in the absence of witness. I found an apartment in Jamaica Plain. I bought a couch. I joined a running group I attended twice before the residency schedule made it impossible to commit to anything on a regular schedule, which I had anticipated and accepted. Wren, who had finished her master's and taken a position at a library in Cambridge, was 20 minutes away by train, and we resumed our Sunday calls in person, which was better than calls. We would walk along the esplanade or sit in her apartment with coffee and talk for 3 hours, which was the same as it had always been, except now we were adults in our late 20s, sitting in a real city, rather than teenagers in an Ohio bedroom, and everything we'd wanted for ourselves had actually happened in the intervening years, which was still surprising to me in small ways. I did not contact my family. I want to be honest about the motivation behind this because it's more complicated than it might appear. Part of it was self-protective. I had tried, repeatedly and comprehensively, in the weeks and months following the initial accusation, and I had been blocked and returned and shut out at every door. At some point, continuing to knock becomes something other than attempting to reconcile. At some point it becomes something you do for your own conscience rather than for any practical effect. I had knocked enough. I had documentation that would have cleared me, and they had chosen not to look at it. I could not force them to look at it. I could not make them want to. But part of it, the part I found harder to sit with, was that by the time I started my residency, 6 years after the lie had been told, I had also built a life that was genuinely mine. Not as consolation, not as substitute, but as its own thing with its own weight and reality and meaning. I had Dr. Acharya, I had Wren, I had colleagues who had watched me work and trusted my judgment. I had patients, the first time a patient's family member thanked me, specifically me, for something I had done during a complicated night shift, something cracked open in me that I didn't have a word for. I had a self that existed and was recognized and had value in the world. Going back to trying to be legible to people who had chosen illegibility felt, by then, like a regression I couldn't afford. This is not the same as having healed. Healing is not required for functioning. I was functioning excellently. I was doing the work that I had always intended to do. I was becoming the physician I had described to Wren on a Friday night in her childhood bedroom. But under all of it, running alongside everything else the way a river runs under ice in winter, quiet but still moving, was the knowledge that my family did not know this person I had become. That the people who had held me as a baby, who had driven me to school, who had made me the sandwiches I ate in childhood, they had chosen to believe the worst possible version of me and close the door, and somewhere in the architecture of me that truth had its own room, and that room stayed the same size no matter how well the rest of the house was built. I thought about them more than I admitted. My mother's hands, which were very specific and familiar, the way she tapped her fingers on the counter when she was thinking, the way she held a coffee cup with both palms. My father's voice when he was not performing anything, when he was just speaking without trying to be anyone, which was rare but real. The house in Millbrook, the particular quality of the light in the kitchen in late afternoon, which was something I had never expected to miss so specifically. I thought about Cassie too in a different way. Less with longing, more with the particular kind of sorrow you feel for someone who has damaged themselves in the act of damaging you, who has built their life on a foundation so unstable that the ground beneath them will, at some point, shift. I did not expect to be there when it shifted. 3 years into my residency, I passed my board examinations and moved into the attending physician track. I was 30 years old. I was an attending physician in internal medicine with a research appointment in Dr. Acharya's lab. She had moved to an affiliated position at Mass General, which was part of why I'd chosen the program, though I would not have admitted the depth of that calculation at the time. I had an office. A small one shared with another attending, but an office with a door and a chair, and a desk where I sat and made notes in charts, and thought about the patients I was responsible for. The work was, and I say this knowing it sounds inadequate, the work was everything I had thought it would be, and then several things beyond that. It was harder and more specific, and more human than any conception of it I had carried through the years of preparation, being responsible for people, being the person in the room who knows and decides. There is a weight to it that I had intellectually understood and could not have actually understood until I was in it, and that weight was not a burden in the way I'd feared it might be. It was, instead, a kind of clarity. When you are responsible for someone's body, the noise of everything else in your life goes very quiet. I had become, by my early 30s, someone who operated on a kind of bedrock. I was not impervious. I had bad days, hard nights, cases that followed me home and wouldn't sit down. But I had the bedrock, the accumulated fact of having built something real and lasting through years of choosing to continue, and that bedrock did not move. The call came on a Thursday in April. It was 6:17 in the morning. I was already at the hospital. I'd been there since 4, working through the overnight turnover with the night team, and my phone was in my pocket, and it vibrated with a number I didn't recognize. An Ohio area code. I almost didn't answer. At 6:17 in the morning, in the middle of a clinical shift, I had every professional reason not to answer a call from an unknown number. But something, the Ohio code, the specific configuration of digits that read, to me, like the ghost of a place I'd come from, made me step into the hallway and pick up. "Is this Rowan Blanchat?" A woman's voice, clipped professional. "This is Dr. Blanchat," I said, and I hadn't meant to emphasize the title. It was just what I said now, it was just what I was, but I heard myself say it and felt, briefly, the specific dissonance of all the years between who I had been and who I was now. "Dr. Blanchat, this is Bate Connors from Ohio State Medical Center. I'm a social worker here. I'm calling about your sister, Cassandra Blanchat. She was in a motor vehicle accident last night. She was airlifted to Massachusetts General Hospital early this morning. She's in critical condition. We're attempting to contact next of kin." The hallway continued to exist. The lights continued to buzz. A nurse walked past me with a chart and did not look up. I stood completely still with the phone held against my ear, and I processed the sentence in parts, the way I sometimes processed difficult information in clinical settings, not all at once, which is overwhelming, but piece by piece, which is manageable. "Cassie, accident, airlifted, Massachusetts General Hospital, critical this morning." "She's here," I said. "She arrived approximately 45 minutes ago," the social worker said. "I understand you're her sister. I was hoping you might be able to help us reach her parents, Diane and Gerald Blanchat. We have a number for them but haven't been able to reach them yet." "I can try," I said, and then, because it needed to be said, even though I had no idea how to say it, "I should let you know that I work at Massachusetts General. I'm an attending physician in internal medicine here." A pause. "Oh," she said. Yes, of course, you'll be able to find out more directly through your colleagues then. I'll make a note that you've been reached." She hung up. I stood in the hallway for exactly 45 seconds, I counted, which is something I do when I need my mind to have a task while the rest of me catches up. And then I looked at the name on the chart board nearest me and thought about the body, somewhere in this building, that was my sister. Then I went and found out which attending was covering her case, because she was not mine to treat. You do not treat family, even former family, even the family that threw you away. And because whatever else was happening inside me, the work was the work and the work didn't change. She was in the surgical ICU. The attending covering her case was Dr. Marcus Webb, who I knew and respected, a meticulous surgeon, the kind who makes decisions at exactly the right pace, not rushed and not delayed. I found him at the nurse's station on the 4th floor, and I told him who I was and what my relationship to the patient was, and he looked at me with a specific kind of attention that physicians give each other when they're assessing how much they need to say versus what can be managed. "She's stable," he said. "For now, head trauma is the primary concern. She was wearing a seat belt, which helped, but the impact was significant. We're monitoring for intracranial pressure. She's got a fractured radius, 3 broken ribs, and a laceration on her left side that we sutured this morning. The next 24 to 48 hours will tell us a lot." "Okay," I said. He looked at me. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said, which was not entirely true but was true in the ways that mattered professionally. "Her parents are on their way. Social work made contact about 20 minutes ago. They're driving in from Ohio. Estimated arrival 4 to 5 hours." He nodded and went back to his notes, and I went and stood in the hallway outside the surgical ICU, and I looked at the door and I thought, my sister is on the other side of that door. I thought about going in. I thought about not going in. I thought about the 14 calls and the returned letter and the closed door and my mother's voicemail, and what Aunt Patricia had said about giving everyone time, and the way my father's voice had sounded on a Tuesday in March 6 years ago when he told me, "Cassie said you'd say that." I thought about the 30 minutes a day in the shower, and the biochemistry notes that had stopped meaning anything, and Dr. Acharya's post-it note, and the champagne at dinner, and Ren saying, "I see you and the bedrock under everything that I had built with my own hands, in the absence of anyone who was supposed to have helped me build it." And then I went in, not to confront anything, not because I had something to say, because she was critical and alone and she was my sister, and she was a human being who was frightened, even unconscious, even sedated, the body in a hospital bed is frightened, and because the physician in me and the person in me were the same person, and neither of them could stand in a hallway. She looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing. Cassie had always occupied space so fully. She had always been a person who filled the room she was in, and now she was in a bed under white blankets with an IV line in her arm and a monitoring lead on her chest and a bandage on her left temple, and she was small. The monitors beeped at even intervals. The room was very quiet. I stood at the foot of the bed for a long time. I didn't touch her. I didn't speak. I just looked at her, which was something I had not done in 6 years, and I tried to locate where all the feelings were and was surprised to find that the primary thing I felt, standing there, was not anger. Not the heat of old injustice, just a strange, settling sadness, the kind you feel for something that has been broken long enough that the break has become the shape of the thing. "You made a mess of this," I said very quietly to my unconscious sister. "Both of us honestly, but you especially." She did not respond. The monitors beeped. I went back to my shift. My parents arrived at 12:47 p.m. I know this because I was at the nurses' station on 3 when the elevator opened, and I looked up from the chart I was reviewing and they walked out. My mother first. She is 62 years old. She looked 62 years old, which she hadn't the last time I'd seen her, which was at a grocery store in Millbrook when I was home for what turned out to be the last visit before the lie, a brief visit, Thanksgiving, 25 years old before everything happened. She had gone grey at her temples, and she was wearing the kind of careful, hold-it-together posture that people carry when they are terrified and don't want to show it. My father behind her, heavier, slower, in the jacket he'd had since I was a teenager, the dark blue one with the collar that he pressed himself on Sunday evenings. They had not seen me. They were looking for signs, for a nurse's station, for someone to tell them where their daughter was. My mother's eyes were scanning the floor with the particular desperate focus of a parent in a hospital, the refusal to stop moving until she had found the person she'd come for. My father saw me first. I watched it happen. I watched him look at me, not recognition immediately, just the intake of a new person in the environment, and then the delay, the recalibration, the running of a face through old files. I watched his expression do something complicated and private that I didn't try to name. "Rowan," he said. My mother turned. The human voice can contain a great many things at once. My mother said my name, 1 word, 2 syllables, the word she'd given me, and in it I heard shock, recognition, confusion, something that might have been hope, and underneath all of it, like the bass note under chord, the specific guilt of someone who knows they have done something they cannot take back. "Mom," I said. "Dad," I set the chart down. "She's in the surgical ICU, she's stable. There was significant head trauma, the attending is Dr. Webb, he's excellent, she's in the best possible place." I was speaking clinically. I know that. I was using the language of the work because it was the only language I had that I could trust not to break in the middle, and because the information was real and necessary and they needed it. But I also watched them receive this information from me, from their daughter they had cut off 6 years ago, standing in front of them in a white coat with her name stitched into the breast pocket, speaking with the authority of someone who belonged in this building, and I watched that land. "You're here," my mother said. "I work here," I said, not unkindly, just fact. "I've been here for 3 years, I'm an attending in internal medicine." Her face did something I don't have a precise word for. Her mouth opened slightly and then closed. My father's jaw tightened in a way I'd always associated with him trying not to feel something visibly. This is where you work," my mother said. "Yes." "You didn't," she stopped, started again. "We didn't know." "You would have," I said, "if we'd been in contact." That settled between us. The hallway was busy around us, nurses, orderlies, the background hum of a working hospital, and we stood in a small clearing of still air in the middle of it. "She's going to be okay," my father said. His voice was controlled, careful. "Dr. Webb can give you more specific information. I don't have clinical involvement in her case, it wouldn't be appropriate." I picked the chart back up. "I can take you to him." I walked them to the 4th floor. I introduced them to Dr. Webb and to the social worker on the case. I answered the questions I could answer factually and deferred the others appropriately. I was professional. I was composed. And then I said I had patients to get back to, and I walked back down the corridor, and I turned a corner and I leaned against the wall for exactly 30 seconds with my eyes closed, and then I went back to work. Ren came to the hospital at 6 that evening. I texted her from between patients, Cassie was in an accident. She's here, my parents are here, I'm fine. And she had responded with 3 texts in rapid succession. Oh my God, are you okay? I'm coming. I told her she didn't have to, and she texted back a single period, which meant she was already on the train. She was waiting for me in the lobby when I finished my shift at 7:15. She was wearing the orange coat she'd had for 4 years that I had seen so many times it had become part of my definition of her, and she stood up when she saw me and just opened her arms, which is what she always did, and I walked into the hug and stood there for a minute. Tell me, she said. We found a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria, which at 7:15 p.m. was mostly empty. The overhead lights dimmed slightly for the dinner crowd that had already gone, and I told her everything. The call at 6:17, Dr. Webb, standing at the foot of Cassie's bed, the moment in the hallway when my parents came off the elevator, what I had said, what they had said. Ren listened with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, watching me the way she'd always watched me, not as someone waiting for her turn to speak, but as someone genuinely trying to see all the layers of what was being said. When I finished, she said, "How do you feel?" "Strange," I said, "not how I expected to feel." "What did you expect?" I thought about it honestly. I expected anger, I expected, I don't know, some kind of satisfaction, proof of what I'd built, look what you missed, that kind of thing. And instead it just felt very sad. I turned my coffee cup in my hands. She looked small, Cassie, in the bed. She looked like a person who'd been running very hard for a very long time. Ren was quiet, then, "That's because she has been." "I know. What happens next?" "I don't know," I said. "My parents are staying at a hotel in Brookline. Cassie is in the ICU. Dr. Webb said maybe 2 more days, then they'll move her to a general ward if she continues to stabilize. There'll be rehabilitation involved, the head trauma is the concern, but it seems contained. She's young enough to recover, she's going to recover." And then whatever happens, happens, I said. "I can't make them talk to me. I couldn't 6 years ago and I can't now. All I can do is be the person I am in the place I'm in." Ren looked at me for a long moment. "You've thought about this a lot," she said. 6 years, I said. She nodded, then, "They saw you today, Ro, in that coat in that hallway. Whatever story Cassie told them, they saw you today." "Seeing isn't the same as understanding," I said. "No," she said, "but it's where understanding starts. My mother found me the next morning. I was in the physician's lounge at 7:45 a.m. before my shift, eating a granola bar and reviewing overnight notes, and I looked up and she was standing in the doorway. She had clearly not slept. Her eyes had the specific weight of a sleepless hospital night, the kind I knew from residency, the gravity that settles under your eyes after hours in a waiting room. She was still in the same clothes she'd arrived in, which meant she'd spent the night at the hospital, which I'd suspected she would. "Can I come in?" she said. I gestured at the chair across from me. She sat the way people sit when they don't know what their body should do, stiffly, with her hands in her lap, as if she were awaiting judgment. I waited. "She's been moved out of the ICU, my mother said." "I saw the update," I said. "That's a good sign." "Dr. Webb said she's doing well." A pause. "He said the same thing you said, that she's in the best possible place." A long pause. "He said she was very lucky." "She was." My mother's hands moved in her lap, restless. Then she said, "How long have you worked here?" 3 years. I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. The room was quiet. Someone had left a newspaper on the counter. The light from the window was early morning grey. "Rowan," my mother said, and then stopped. I waited. "I owe you," she stopped again, tried a different angle. "What Cassie told us." "Yes," I said. Her voice changed register slightly. "We looked at the documentation you sent, eventually. Gerald found it in the archived emails about 2 years later. She closed her eyes. He didn't say anything to me for a week. He just went quiet and then he showed it to me and she stopped. I sat with this 2 years later. They had found it 2 years later. That meant 4 years ago they had looked at what I had sent them and understood what it meant and said nothing to me, said nothing for 4 years. "You looked at it," I said. "Yes." "And you knew." A silence that was its own kind of answer. Why didn't you call me? I said, and I was surprised as I said it by how clean the question felt. Not charged, not cracking, just the question resting in the air between us. She looked at her hands. I was a long, honest silence. We were ashamed, she said. We didn't know how to, she stopped again. What Cassie had told everyone, what everyone believed, we would have had to tell everyone they were wrong, we would have had to. Admit that you chose wrong, I said. She looked up at me. Her eyes were very dark, the way they always were, the way Cassie's were. My eyes are different, more hazel, my grandmother's eyes, and I thought about that for a moment, the way inheritance works, who gets what and why. Yes, she said, that we chose wrong. I could hear the weight in it. Not an excuse, she wasn't offering it as an excuse, she was offering it as truth, which was more than I had expected. I sat with it. And Cassie, I said, you talked to Cassie. Yes. Did she admit it? My mother was quiet for a long time, long enough that I began to understand the shape of the answer before she gave it. She didn't use that word, my mother said, but she, a very careful breath. She said she might have misunderstood the documents she'd seen. She said she thought the account numbers matched. A pause. Your father asked her to show him the original documents she'd used. She said she couldn't find them. Because they didn't exist, I said, not as accusation, just information. My mother nodded very slightly, once. Did you tell anyone else, I said, in the family? Your father spoke to Patricia last year, she said. We told her we'd misunderstood the situation, that you hadn't done what we thought. Not that Cassie had lied, not that they had been wrong, that they had misunderstood, that the situation had been unclear, the careful management of language to preserve the shape of things even as the content of them shifted. But you didn't call me, I said. No. Or write. No. Or try to reach me in any way. The pause stretched out. No, she said, we didn't. I sat with this for a long time, long enough that I heard the hospital wake up around us, the shift change sounds, the distant voice on an intercom, the particular hum of a building that never fully sleeps. I sat with the fact that they had known for 4 years that what had been done to me was wrong, and they had said nothing, reached for nothing, done nothing. And I had continued, in the meantime, to become a physician in the same city where my sister would eventually be airlifted, to build the life I'd been building, to carry the bedrock. I don't know what to do with this, I said finally. My mother looked at me. Neither do I, she said. And somehow, in the honesty of that, in the fact that she was not offering me a resolution she didn't have, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, and maybe not in the way that word normally implies, but something. She's going to need rehabilitation, I said. Depending on the cognitive outcomes, it could take months. We'll stay, my mother said. You can stay as long as you need to, I said. If you need resources, hotel recommendations, anything about the rehabilitation facilities in the area, I can help with that. My mother looked at me. You'd help us, she said, not as a question, more as a thing she was trying to absorb. I'd help you find what Cassie needs, I said. That's not the same thing, but it's what I can do right now. She nodded. She stood up slowly, the way people stand when they're older than they'd planned to be in a particular moment. At the door she turned back. Rowan, she said, I know this doesn't, she stopped. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, it's not. She stopped again, and I could see her looking for words that were adequate and finding correctly that none of them were. I know it doesn't fix it. No, I said, it doesn't. She nodded and went. Cassie woke up fully on the 3rd day. Responsive, oriented, lucid, the cognitive assessment was encouraging, which Dr. Webb communicated to the family with the careful optimism of someone who has learned not to promise outcomes he cannot guarantee. There was some memory disruption around the accident itself and the hours immediately preceding it, but her long-term memory was intact. Her speech was clear. She knew who she was and where she was. She knew by the 3rd day that her sister worked in the hospital where she had been brought. I know she knew because the nurse covering her ward, a woman named Deshawn who had been my orientation buddy during residency and was one of my most trusted colleagues, came to find me between patients on the afternoon of the 3rd day and said, Hey, your sister's asking to see you. I stood in the hallway outside the stairwell. She said that specifically, I said. She said, is my sister here, the doctor? Yeah, specifically. I thought about saying no. I thought about it with full seriousness as a real option, because I had spent 3 days managing this situation with professional remove, and some part of me, the part that had built the 30-minute protocol and the bedrock and the life, wanted to protect that remove, wanted to stay in the version of this where I was the physician and she was the patient's family, and the distance was clean. But she had asked, and she had called me her sister. "Tell her I'll come by when I have a break," I said. I went at 4:30. Her room was on 6, a private room her parents had arranged, and the light in it at 4:30 was the particular late afternoon light that falls across hospitals in April, golden and slightly melancholy, the kind of light that makes everything look both more real and more fragile. She was sitting up in bed. The bandage on her temple was smaller now, and some of the swelling had reduced. She still looked smaller than I remembered. She looked at me when I came in. I pulled the chair to the side of the bed and sat. I did not stand over her, which would have felt performative in a way I didn't want. We were on the same level. That felt right. "Hive," she said. "Hive," I said. A very long silence. "Mom told you," she said. "She told me some things, yes." Cassie looked at the window. Her hands were in her lap, the radius on her right arm wrapped, the fingers of that hand slightly swollen still. She was 34 years old, and she looked, sitting there like a person who had reached the end of a very long road and found that there was nothing at the end of it. Not nothing bad, just nothing. The absence of the thing they'd been moving toward. "I've been thinking about how to say this for a long time," she said. "Take your time," I said. She was quiet. Then, "I didn't plan it," she said. "That's not," she stopped. "I know that's not an excuse. I'm not trying to excuse it. She looked at me. "You called from Cleveland and you were so happy you were so," she stopped again. "I waited. I'd been home for 8 months," she said. "Mom and Dad's house, working a job I hated, and you called and you were getting this, you were building this whole thing, and everyone was going to be so proud of you. The doctor, you were going to be the doctor, and I was going to be," she gestured with her good hand, "whatever I was." "Cassie," I said. "I know," she said. "I know how that sounds. I know I'm not saying you shouldn't have had it. I'm saying I was angry about it in a way I wasn't honest with myself about. And then it all just," she made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, "spiraled, way past where I meant for it to go. Once they believed it, and then I'd have had to say I'd made it up, and everyone was so," she trailed off. "Committed to the story," I said. "Yes. And it was easier to let it be true," I said. She closed her eyes. "Yes," she said. Silence. The monitors beeped. Somewhere down the hall a cart wheeled past. "You understand what you took," I said. My voice was very even. Not cold. I didn't feel cold toward her in this moment, which surprised me, but very clear. "Not just the family, you know that. You took 6 years of being known by the people who were supposed to know me. My mother's voice when she found out I got into medical school, my father at my graduation, every holiday, every Sunday call that was just to me, not to resolve anything, just to talk. You took those. They don't come back." She opened her eyes. They were wet. "I know," she said. "I don't need you to cry about it," I said, not unkindly. "I need you to understand it. Those are 2 different things." "I know," she said again. And I actually thought that she did, that the accident had done something to the story she'd been telling herself, shaken it loose from whatever moorings she'd constructed. That lying in a hospital bed in your sister's hospital might do that to a person. "I'm not ready to forgive you," I said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know," she said. "I don't know if I ever will be in the full sense. I don't know if forgiveness is the right frame." "Okay," she said. "But I'm sitting here," I said. "That's real. I'm sitting here and I'm not walking out. That's something." She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes were her mother's eyes, our mother's eyes, the dark eyes that didn't blink when they were taking something in seriously. "You became a doctor," she said. It wasn't a non sequitur. I understood what she meant. "Yes," I said. "Without us." "Yes." "I thought," she stopped. "I thought you'd fail. I think I told myself that without Mom and Dad supporting you, without the family, I thought you'd come home." "I almost didn't make it through the first year," I said honestly. "Not academically, personally, it was very hard." She absorbed this. "But you didn't come home," she said. "No," I said, "I didn't." She nodded once, the careful nod of someone filing information in a new way. I started therapy, she said, 8 months ago before the accident. Good, I said. I've been trying to understand why I did it. The therapist has. She almost smiled very briefly. She has a lot of questions about our family, about all of us. That sounds right, I said. She thinks I've been performing for Mom and Dad my whole life. That when you came along and actually showed them something real, something they didn't understand but that was clearly going somewhere important, I panicked. Basically. That tracks, I said. Does it make sense to you that I was scared? I thought about it. I understand it, I said. Understanding it is not the same as it being okay. I know, she said. I'm not asking for it to be okay. Then yes, I said, it makes sense. We sat in the golden April light for a while longer. Not resolved, nothing was resolved, nothing could be resolved in a single hospital room conversation, and I didn't want her to think it could be. But present. 2 sisters in a room, 6 years of silence and lies and distance between them, and both of them present in it. I'm going to check on you medically, I said when I stood up. Through web, not directly, I'll stay out of your case, but I'm going to be paying attention. She nodded. And when you're recovered enough to have a real conversation, I said, we'll have one. Okay, she said. With Mom and Dad in the room, I said, all of it. Her jaw tightened slightly. Okay, she said again. I went to the door, then I turned back because there was one more thing. You asked the nurse to tell me you wanted to see me, I said. You called me your sister. She looked at me. That mattered, I said. I want you to know that. And I went back to my shift. The conversation with my father happened 2 days later. My mother had clearly told him about our morning in the physician's lounge, and he had spent 2 days with whatever he did with things. My father processed internally, always had, a quality I had inherited and could recognize in myself, and then he found me in the hallway outside the elevator bank on 5. He was not a man who cried. He was not a man who had cried in any memory I had of him. So when I saw his face as I came off the elevator, that particular arrangement of a person's features when they have been inside something too large for them to contain, I did not know what to do with it. Dad, I said. Rowan, he said. We stood in the hallway. Walk with me, I said, because standing still in a busy hallway was not the right setting for whatever this was going to be, and I started moving toward the family waiting area at the end of the corridor, which was empty at that time of day, and he fell into step beside me. We sat down in the waiting area, 2 chairs facing the window, a table with a box of tissues between us that was there for all the families that sat in this room for much worse reasons than we were here, and I waited. Your mother told me what she told you, he said, about the documentation. Yes. I found it, he said, what you sent in the archived emails 2 years after. He was looking at the window. I read it and I wanted to call you that night. Your mother and I argued about it. She was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid it would make Cassie. He stopped. We didn't want to create more conflict in the family. I looked at the window too, a grey April sky. A crane in the distance, some building going up, the constant construction of a city that keeps remaking itself. You were protecting Cassie, I said. We were, he stopped, tried again. We didn't think it through, how it would look to you, how it would feel to you. We were managing what we could see, and we forgot that you couldn't see any of it. I couldn't see any of it because I'd been blocked, I said, not to wound, just to keep the facts in the room. Yes, he said, I know. Silence, the crane moved against the grey sky. I'm proud of you, he said quietly. I want to say that first before anything else, what you've built, I watched you in that hallway when your mother and I came off the elevator, and I thought there's my daughter, there's the person she always was, and he stopped for a long time. I missed it, he said. I missed it happening, that's mine to live with. I felt the words settle in my chest, not as balm exactly, not as resolution, but as something, the specific truth of a parent saying they were wrong in the plainest terms available to them, which is the most any of us can ask for. You can't unmiss it, I said. I can't give those years back to you. I know, and I can't be the person who was here the whole time. I'm the person who built something without a family, and it made me, I thought about how to say it, it made me very self-sufficient, in ways that are good and in ways that are probably not. He looked at me for the first time in the conversation. His face was older than I was used to. Fathers age in your absence in ways they don't when you see them regularly, and it had the particular texture of a face that has held something heavy for a long time. "What do you need," he said, "from us, going forward if there is a going forward?" It was, I thought, exactly the right question. Not what can we do, which implies the answer is theirs to generate. Not how can we fix this, which implies it's fixable in the way a broken thing is fixable. What do you need? Putting it in my hands. Time, I said, not fast, not a dramatic gesture. Time and consistency. You show up regularly, not just in a crisis. Okay, he said. And the truth, I said, with everyone in the family who was told the lie, not there was a misunderstanding, the truth. His jaw tightened. That's going to be a difficult conversation. I know, I said. I'm not asking you to have it tomorrow, I'm asking you to have it. He was quiet for a long moment, then he nodded. Okay, he said. And Cassie, I said, she needs real help, not the family kind where everyone manages around the problem. Real help. She started therapy, that needs to continue. We'll support that, he said. I stood up, he stood too. Dad, I said, he looked at me. I don't know what this looks like. Going forward, I'm not promising anything and I'm not closing any doors. I'm telling you the same thing I told Cassie. I'm sitting here, that's real. He nodded, and then very carefully, the way you do something you're not sure will be received, he put his hand on my shoulder, just for a moment. His hand on my shoulder, the same hand that had held the lug wrench in the church parking lot when I was 15, the same hand. I let it rest there. Cassie spent 11 days at Mass General before she was stable enough to transfer to a rehabilitation facility in Newton. The head trauma had been the main concern, and the outcomes were better than initial projections. There was some persistent headache and some light sensitivity that the neurologist said was likely to resolve over time, and the physical recovery was going to be lengthy but not indefinite. My parents stayed for 9 of those 11 days. They stayed at a hotel in Brookline that I found for them through the hospital's social work resources, a decent rate, good location, the kind of place that felt like a sensible choice rather than either too sparse or too extravagant. My mother texted me every evening with an update. Not long texts, 2-3 sentences, Cassie's status, sometimes a mention of something she and my father had done that day. I responded with the same register. Short. Real, not performed. It was awkward. I want to be honest about this because the version of this story where the hospital becomes a site of tearful reunion and the family is instantly restored would be false, and the falseness would be an insult to everyone who'd actually been through it. It was profoundly awkward. We were 6 years of estrangement and decades of complicated history meeting in a hospital hallway in a city one of us had been in all along and all of them hadn't known. The awkward was appropriate. The awkward was the honest shape of where we were. I had coffee with my mother twice, once in the physician's lounge, which was where she'd found me that first morning, once in a cafe around the corner from the hospital, which felt slightly less institutional and therefore slightly more real. We talked about Cassie's recovery both times and then, around the edges of it, about other things, my work, her work, my father's retirement plans, which I hadn't known about. At some point in the second coffee, she started telling me about the garden she'd planted at the house last spring, the tomatoes and the way the rabbits kept getting into the beans, and I sat across from her and listened to her talk about her garden the way I hadn't listened to her talk about ordinary things in 6 years, and it was both nothing and everything. Aunt Patricia called me on day 7. The call came on a Tuesday morning, my day off, and I was at the running path by the esplanade where the running group I'd joined and abandoned met. I went alone now, just for the habit, and I stood by the water and answered. Rowan, she said. Her voice was different than I remembered, older and underneath that careful in a new way. Aunt Patty, I said. Your dad called me, she said. He told me, he explained what happened, all of it, a pause. He told me what Cassie, she stopped, what was actually true. I watched a crew boat on the Charles, 8 rowers moving in precise synchrony, the coxswain calling from the stern. Okay, I said. I want to say I'm sorry, she said. I said some things to you when you tried to reach out, I turned you away. Yes, I said. I believed the wrong person, she said, because it was easier to believe her than to ask questions that would have, she stopped. I'm sorry, Rowan. I know, I said. We were quiet for a moment. The photo, she said, of your graduation, I still have it on the mantel. I hadn't expected that. The crew boat moved away down the river, the 8 oars lifting and falling. I didn't know that, I said. I didn't take it down, she said. Even after, I thought about it, but she made a small sound. I didn't know what I believed. I don't think I fully believed it. I think I didn't ask because asking would have required me to do something about the answer. This was perhaps the most honest thing anyone in my family had said about this. The specific cowardice of not asking because you don't want to know. I sat with it without judgment because judgment would have been easier than understanding, and understanding was what I was trying to build. Thank you for calling, I said. I'd like to, she stopped. If you ever want to visit Millbrook, or if we can come see you, your father said you've been in Boston. I have, I said. I'd like that someday, not immediately, but someday. Okay, she said. Okay, that's good. When I hung up, I stood by the river for a long time. The boat was gone around the bend. The water was the particular green-grey of April water, not quite cold anymore but not warm, that middle state that could go either way. I called Ren. How are you doing? She said, picking up on the second ring as she always did. Strange, I said, still strange. Yeah, she said, that makes sense. Aunt Patricia called. What did she say? I told her. Ren listened. When I finished, she said, you know what I keep thinking about? What? The science competition, she said. When you were 16, you won and they barely. Ren, I'm saying, she said, that was always going to lead here. Who you were at 16 in that church parking lot, who you were in the stairwell at 23, who you are now in that hallway. It's the same person. It was always the same person. I was quiet for a moment. They're starting to see it, I said. Yeah, she said, finally. The rehabilitation centre in Newton was bright and well-staffed and smelled, as all such places do, of specific industrial cleaning products and the underlying effort of recovery. I visited on a Saturday, 2 weeks after Cassie transferred, my parents having returned to Ohio by then. They had jobs, routines, they couldn't stay indefinitely, and Cassie was stable and in good hands. I brought coffee from the place I liked in Jamaica Plain, 2 cups, one for each of us, and I sat in the visitor's room with my sister. She was better. Maury herself, or a version of herself I could see working toward the person she was before the accident, though I suspected that person would be different going forward. The bandage on her temple was gone, just a pale scar. The swelling in her hand was resolved. She moved more carefully than she used to, still dealing with the headaches, but she was present in a way she hadn't been in the hospital room, more awake behind her eyes. We talked for 2 hours. Real talking, not the managed essential information talking of the hospital room. Real conversation about her therapy, which she was doing 3 times a week, and which she described with a kind of wry exhaustion that sounded to me like someone actually doing the work rather than performing it. About her plans when she recovered, she didn't know yet, and I respected the honesty of not knowing. About what she wanted from her life, which was also not entirely clear to her and which she said, with a precision that surprised me, might be the first time in her life she was actually asking that question rather than performing the answer. I told her about the lab, about Dr. Acharya, who she'd never heard of, who had been the cornerstone of my life for 8 years, who had given a toast at my graduation while my family was absent, who I would have described as the person who saw me more clearly than anyone except Ren for most of my adult life. Cassie listened with attention. Not guilt, I wasn't telling her as indictment, just as fact. This is who was there. This is how I built it. She sounds incredible, Cassie said. She is, I said. You should introduce me, she said. Sometime, when this is, she gestured at herself, when I'm not quite so literally broken. I will, I said, and meant it. We talked about Ren too. Cassie had always known Ren, they'd existed in adjacent spheres through childhood, the same town, and I told her Ren was 20 minutes away, that she had been my anchor through all of it. She always saw through me, Cassie said, not defensively, Maury as acknowledgement. Yes, I said, she did. She was right too, Cassie said. At some point in the second hour, a quiet settled between us that wasn't uncomfortable. Just the quiet of 2 people sitting with the truth of what has happened and allowing it to be what it is without needing to fill it. The afternoon light came in at a different angle than the hospital room light, had a west-facing window, lower in the sky. It was the same April that had always been happening, outside all of this, indifferent and continuing. I'm going to pay you back, Cassie said. I looked at her. Not the money, there's no money, there never was, I know that. She was looking at the window. But what I took, I can't give it back. But I'm going to show up. I'm going to do the things that demonstrate that I understand what I did and that I'm different from the person who did it. Those are actions, not words, I said. Yes, she said, I know. I'll watch for them, I said. I know you will, she said, and she almost smiled. You were always very careful about what you believed. I had to be, I said. I know, she said. My parents came back in July. Not for a crisis this time, just to visit. My mother had texted 3 weeks earlier asking if she and my father could come to Boston for a weekend. She'd asked it carefully, the way you ask something when you're aware you don't have the standing you once had and are trying not to assume. I said yes. I found them a hotel, the same one in Brookline, which they'd liked. I cleared my Saturday. They arrived on a Friday evening. I met them at the hotel, which felt strange and right simultaneously. A hotel, not my apartment, because my apartment was mine and I was managing the pace of this, which was my right, and I exercised it. We walked to a restaurant near the common that I liked. We ate dinner. We talked for 3 hours. Not about the lie. Not directly. That conversation had happened in its various forms, and what remained of it were the facts, which were settled, and the consequences, which were ongoing. We talked about ordinary things. My father's retirement timeline, which was more concrete now. My mother's garden. Cassie's progress, which was steady. She'd moved to outpatient therapy, which meant she was living in a rented room in Newton near the rehabilitation center, working part-time at a bookstore while she figured out the next steps. They had helped her set this up. I noticed this and said nothing but filed it, the slow, difficult, patient work of people trying to do better. At one point, my father asked about my research, not politely, with genuine interest, leaning forward slightly, the way people do when they're actually listening. I told him about the wound healing project, the cellular regeneration study, the new direction we were exploring around inflammation markers. He didn't understand all of it, but he nodded and asked a follow-up question that was, in its specificity, a real question from someone who was trying to follow. When I walked them back to the hotel, my mother hugged me at the door. A real hug, not the brief, managed hug of people who are practicing, the kind of hug that contains years in it. I let it be what it was. My father put his hand out as if to shake mine, and then seemed to reconsider and put his arm around my shoulders briefly instead. It was awkward. It was imperfect. It was real. I walked home along the esplanade in the July dark, the river on one side and the city on the other, and I thought about the conversation with Ren after everything had first happened, the question of what I needed, what I was building, what remained. I thought about the 30 minutes a day in the shower. I thought about Dr. Acharya's post-it note. I thought about Ren saying I see you in the rubble. I thought about being 16 in the parking lot of the church with a lug wrench, my father showing me something real on a cold Saturday, and the way I had understood then that it was enough, that a parking lot and a cold Saturday and a father who was trying, in the limited language he had, to give me something that was enough. I had spent a long time knowing things were enough without knowing that they were also allowed to grow. In August, Cassie came to my apartment. Not for anything specific. She texted me on a Tuesday, "Are you free this weekend? I want to see where you live," and I said yes. She took the train from Newton. I buzzed her up. She came into my apartment and looked around at it, at the books and the plants and the framed photo of Ren and me at her master's graduation, and the small painting I'd bought at a market in Cleveland and carried through every move since, and she was quiet for a moment. "It looks like you," she said. "Yeah," I said. She walked to the bookshelf and looked at the spines. She stopped at a volume on cellular biology, the original annotated, falling apart copy I'd bought second-hand in college, the one with my undergraduate handwriting in the margins, and she pulled it out and looked at the cover. "How long have you had this?" she said. 15 years, I said. She put it back carefully. I made coffee. We sat at the small table by the window. Below us, the street was doing its Saturday afternoon things, couples walking dogs, someone unlocking a bike, a child on a scooter with a parent following at an adult's pace. Normal things, the ongoing life of a city. "How's therapy?" I said. "Hard," she said. "The therapist, Dr. Vasquez, she doesn't let me be performative. I'll say something that sounds like insight and she'll just look at me and say, okay, and what's actually happening? She made a face. Exhausting. Good, I said. She laughed briefly, genuinely. Yeah, I know. We talked for 3 hours. Easier than before, not easy, not without the awareness of everything that had happened and was still happening, but easier. The kind of conversation where you can stop in the middle of a sentence and both people know what the other was going to say. The kind of conversation that requires history, even painful history, to exist at all. At some point she said, "Do you remember when I taught you to ride a bike?" I did remember. I was 7, she was 10, and she had been inexplicably patient, not the Cassie of later years but the Cassie of that specific afternoon, who had run alongside me for 45 minutes on the sidewalk in front of our house and caught me every time I listed left, which was my consistent failing direction, until eventually I didn't list left anymore. I remember, I said. I was proud of you, she said. That afternoon, I remember thinking you were going to just keep learning things forever. A pause. I was right about that part. You were, I said. She looked at her coffee cup. I was supposed to be the one who helped you. That's what I wanted to be. And then I got scared of who you were becoming and she stopped. I tried to stop it instead. It didn't work, I said. No, she said, it didn't. Nothing stops it, I said. I learned that. Whatever is in you that you're meant to do, it just keeps going. People can make it harder, but they can't make it stop. She looked at me for a long moment. Are you still angry? She said. I thought about it honestly. There's still something, I said. I don't know if angry is the right word anymore. It's something adjacent. Grief, maybe, for the years, for the version of us that didn't have to happen. Me too, she said. But I'm not angry at you the way I was, I said. Anger requires believing the other person had no reason. You had reasons, bad ones, but reasons. That's more than I deserve, she said. Maybe, I said, but it's where I am. She nodded. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I want to rebuild this, she said. I know I don't get to decide what that means. I know it's yours to decide. I'm just saying I want to. I know, I said. I can see that. Is there room? She said. And it was a genuine question, not a plea. She wasn't asking me to give her an answer that would make her feel better. She was asking because she actually needed to know. I looked at my apartment, the books and the plants and the life I had built in the years of being alone. I looked at my sister across the table from me, 34 years old, 3 months out of a car accident, working at a bookstore and going to therapy 3 times a week, and taking the train across the city on a Saturday to ask if there was room. Yes, I said, there's room. We had dinner together in September. All 4 of us, my parents who had driven in from Ohio again, and Cassie and me. My apartment. I cooked, which I do well after years of teaching myself because cooking was one of the ways I'd given myself care during the years when care was scarce. Nothing elaborate. Pasta with a slow-cooked sauce, salad, bread from the bakery around the corner. A bottle of wine that was better than $7. It was uncomfortable, initially. The 4 of us in my kitchen with the small table that could technically seat 4 but whose doing so required the kind of close proximity that reminded everyone that we were all sitting here, in an apartment that 2 of them had never been in a city that had been mine alone for a very long time, around a life that had been built entirely without them. My father knocked something over reaching for the bread and said sorry, in a way that carried more weight than a knocked-over thing warranted. My mother asked too many questions about the plates, which were plain white and serviceable and not interesting, because she was doing the thing she always did when she was nervous, which was to be interested in objects around her. Cassie was quiet in the first half of the dinner in the particular way of someone monitoring the room and trying to make sure they are not doing anything wrong, which I recognized as effort and appreciated. And then at some point, I couldn't tell you exactly when, because it wasn't a moment, it was a gradual shift, the conversation loosened. My father made a joke about his retirement and his inability to figure out what to do with a whole day. My mother told a story about the neighbor's dog who had learned to open the gate and was treating their yard as communal property. Cassie asked me about a case I'd mentioned offhandedly, something I'd said about a patient presentation that had been interesting from a research standpoint, and I told her more, and she asked follow-up questions that showed she'd been listening, and we had an actual conversation about it, the kind that builds on itself, and I noticed that my father was listening to it with genuine interest. It was not a family portrait moment. Nobody was pretending that everything was fixed or that the years of absence had been replaced. There was still, under all of it, the structural fact of what had happened and what it had cost. But there were also 4 plates on a table in an apartment in Boston, and 4 people making an effort that each of them understood was an effort. That's what it was, an effort, real and imperfect and ongoing. After they left, my parents to Brookline, Cassie to Newton, I sat at the table with the remains of the dinner, and I thought about the moment 6 years earlier when I had sat on the floor of my studio apartment watching red receipts disappear. The specific quality of that silence, how absolute it had felt. I thought about what had survived that silence, what had been built in it. I thought about the parking lot, and the lug wrench, and the cold Saturday, and the science competition, and 30 minutes a day in the shower, and the bedrock, and Dr. Acharya's post-it note, and Wren's orange coat, and I see you and the ship that had not stopped going. The work doesn't change, Dr. Acharya had said. That's not dismissal, that's something to hold on to. I held on to it. October brought the kind of Boston autumn that makes you understand why people stay in New England despite everything, the specific gold of the trees on Com Ave, the sharp clean air, the sense that the city is wearing its best clothes for a short time before everything goes grey. I ran every morning that month. I finished a paper for the cellular regeneration study that Dr. Acharya and I had been working on for 2 years, the longest and most rigorous piece of research I'd yet put my name on, and submitted it on a Thursday afternoon, and then sat in my office for 20 minutes doing nothing, which is the thing I do when I've finished something significant. Cassie called that evening. She'd found out about the submission somehow. I think my mother told her. I'd mentioned it to my mother, and she called to say congratulations. "What's the paper about?" she said, and so I told her the whole of it, the hypothesis, the methodology, the results, what it might mean, what we still didn't know, why it mattered. She listened all the way through. "Send it to me when it publishes," she said. "I want to read it." "You won't understand most of it," I said. "I'll figure it out," she said. "You have footnotes, right?" I laughed, actually laughed. It surprised me briefly, the ease of it. "Yeah," I said, "I have footnotes." "Then send it." I said I would. What I know now at 31, that I didn't know at 25, is that the truth is not a moment. It's a process. It's not a courtroom scene where the lie is exposed and everyone gasps and reality is instantly restored. The truth works the way the body works, quietly, persistently, at a cellular level over time. The lie my sister told was not dispelled in a single confrontation. It was dispelled gradually, inevitably, under the weight of evidence that accumulated despite everything. The documentation I sent, the years that passed, the fact of me at a nurse's station in a white coat when my parents came off the elevator. The truth kept working even when no one was watching it. It didn't expire. It didn't need me to manage it. I managed myself. That was the job. To keep doing the work when the work was all I had. To find, in the absence of the family I was supposed to have, the people who chose me and whom I could choose in return. To build the bedrock not because someone was watching, but because the bedrock was real, and real things have weight, and weight is what holds you when the stories around you collapse. I also know this, letting time reveal something is not the same as passivity. I did not sit quietly and wait for vindication. I tried repeatedly and thoroughly to fix what was broken through every channel available to me. I sent documentation. I called, I wrote, I used intermediaries. I did not succeed in the way I wanted to because success in that early stage required the other people in the situation to want the truth as much as I did, and they didn't, not then. What I did was refuse to let their choice about the truth become my belief about myself. I let them have their story. I built a different one, not a counter-story, not a retaliation, a life. A real, working, rigorous, cellular life, building from the inside out, the way the body builds itself. That's what I mean when I say I let time reveal what she tried to hide. I didn't expose Cassie. Time did that. The weight of a constructed reality will always eventually meet something it can't hold, an accident, a document in an archived email folder, a daughter standing in a hospital hallway in a white coat when you come off the elevator. I just had to still be standing there when it happened. I want to say something to you if you've been reading this far. If you are in the middle of a version of this, if you have been lied about, turned against, shut out by people who were supposed to be your foundation, I am not going to tell you that the ending looks like mine. I got lucky in specific ways. I had Wren. I had Dr. Acharya. I had Case Western and Mass General and the specific kind of work that was mine to do and that didn't require anyone's permission to pursue. Not everyone has all of those things. I am not going to pretend that surviving something like this is just a matter of deciding to. But I will tell you this, the version of you that they rejected is not the evidence that you are rejectable. The version of you that they couldn't see is not the version that is true. The story they're telling about you, the one that travels through family texts and Sunday dinners and quietly decided verdicts, that story is about them. It's their fear and their calculation and their particular inability to hold the complexity of who you actually are. You are the one who has to live inside the truth of yourself, and that truth doesn't require their validation to function. Stop waiting to be seen by the people who have decided not to look. Start being seen by the work you do, by the friends who choose you, by the version of yourself you meet on the mornings when you keep going anyway. The truth doesn't expire. See yourself first. Last Sunday, I had brunch at Wren's apartment in Cambridge. She'd made eggs, which she makes badly and has always made badly, and Wick,